Between 1831 and 1847, something strange happened across the Cotton Belt from Charleston to New Orleans. 17 young women, all between 14 and 16, appeared out of nowhere in Southern high society. They married rich planters and merchants, and every single one of them shared the same odd details. No one could find any record of their families before they turned 10. No Southern birth records, and, more disturbing, most of them disappeared from public life within 3 years of marriage. The handful who lasted long enough to tell their stories, always whispering, always shaking, spoke about a woman they called the finisher. She wasn't just a rumor. Old court records, sealed tight in 1849, mention her by name. She bought children at auctions across 5 states, then ran what the authorities, behind closed doors, called a school for acceptable wives. What you're about to read is the story of Celestine Vacherie and her institution, a place that took stolen childhoods and turned them into something profitable. This account comes straight from depositions, hidden letters, and testimony 3 different governors tried to bury. But before we dig into Celestine Vacherie and the Maison de Grace, tell us where you're tuning in from. Louisiana? Mississippi? Alabama? Somewhere else in the South? Leave your city or state in the comments. Stories like this didn't just haunt one place. They crept through the shadows everywhere in America. We want to know where these lost stories are finding you, and if you want more, don't forget to subscribe. Let's wind back to where this all really started. Autumn 1829. That year, the heat didn't let up around New Orleans. In the Garden District, grand mansions hid behind iron gates, all white columns and polished brass. But nobody paid much attention to a modest 2-story house on Britannia Street. Its shutters always snapped shut, the garden wild and overgrown, jasmine and oleander nearly swallowing the path. A small brass plate by the door simply read, Maison de Grace, Private Academy for Young Ladies. Celestine Vacherie arrived that September with perfect-looking credentials, letters from Charleston, glowing references from a Savannah finishing school, closed supposedly by yellow fever, and a small inheritance that let her rent the house and hire a staff. She was 34, spoke French with a Creole lilt that sounded old Louisiana, and moved with the strict poise of someone trained in European schools. The neighbors who bothered to ask learned that Madame Vacherie ran a school for orphaned girls from once prosperous families. She never welcomed visitors. No one saw the girls outside. The thick walls and closed shutters kept everything inside hidden. Celestine Vacherie wasn't really an educator, though. She was a businesswoman, and she'd spotted a gap in the market. In the slaveholding South of the 1830s, society ran on a tangled web of rules and appearances. Wealthy planters needed wives who knew every bit of the Southern code, running large households full of enslaved workers, handling social events, producing legitimate heirs. Daughters of old families learned this from birth, just by living and watching. But what about the new rich? The overseers who'd scraped together enough money to buy land, the merchants whose fortunes grew from trade and not inheritance? These men were shut out. No established family wanted their daughters marrying upstarts. Their invitations went ignored. Their proposals, gently refused. Celestine Vacherie saw these men would pay a fortune for wives who looked respectable, could run a home, and wouldn't ask questions. Women with no family to meddle, no brothers to demand answers, no inheritance to tangle up a will. Girls who could be bought, trained, and sold, plain and simple. Her first acquisition came in October 1829 at an estate auction in Charleston. The auctioneer moved quickly through the bankrupt family's belongings. Furniture, silver, and then 3 enslaved children, 2 boys and a girl. The boys sold fast. Field hands always did. But the girl, maybe 9 years old and light-skinned, lingered. Old Southern pedigrees. Just like that, they slipped from one world to another. Claire was just a little girl when Celestine bought her for $70. She was old enough to work, but still so young, with no family, no story. Just a name scribbled in a bill of sale, Celia. That was it. No last name, no history. Celestine changed that instantly. She called her Claire Devo now. On the way back to New Orleans, she burned the girl's rough slave clothes and dressed her in a plain but clean cotton dress. She told Claire not to speak unless spoken to, taught her to keep her eyes lowered around white adults, not out of fear, but the way a polite, well-bred girl would. You're not that child anymore, Celestine told her in French. That girl died. You're Claire Devo now. Your family came from Mobile. They had money once, but lost it. Your parents died of fever. You have no brothers or sisters. You remember nothing before my school. Understand?" Claire nodded, but she didn't really get it. Her life was being wiped out and rewritten on the spot. At the Maison de Grace, Claire met two other girls. Celestine had bought them quietly from families desperate to hide the existence of children who could never be acknowledged. These girls had lighter skin, which made them fit Celestine's plan. They could pass for white in a city obsessed with drawing lines between races. Unless money got involved, then those lines blurred fast. The school wasn't really a school. The girls woke up before dawn. They stitched for hours, fingers aching, until their work was so fine it was nearly invisible. They ran Celestine's household, cooking, cleaning, handling laundry, keeping the accounts. No books, just relentless practice. Tutors came and went, teaching them to read just enough to manage ledgers and prayer books, to add and subtract, to memorize the names and tangled relationships of every important Southern family. They learned how to survive a dinner party, which topics to avoid, which gestures marked you as refined, how to catch every undercurrent in a conversation without ever letting on what you didn't know. But above all, they learned to keep quiet. Smile, deflect, never reveal anything real. Their pasts were dead. You emerged at age 10, Celestine drilled into them. Anyone asks? Your family died. It's too sad to talk about, so you look to the future. That's your answer every time until you believe it yourself. The training was ruthless. If a girl questioned or resisted, Celestine locked her in a tiny room until she broke. If someone tried to run, the authorities brought her back. No questions asked. Just a guardian disciplining her charges. Anyone who tried to tell the truth was ignored. No one believed a black child over a respectable white woman with papers to prove her story. Celestine kept records for each girl, a whole invented life, with older birth dates, fake family trees, forged baptisms, letters from imaginary dead relatives. The lies were so detailed that sometimes they felt more solid than the truth. By 1831, Celestine had it all down to a science. She started traveling to auctions in Charleston, Mobile, Savannah, Richmond, always hunting for girls between 8 and 10, pale enough to pass, clever, adaptable, with European features. She never went back to the same auctioneer twice in a year. She switched names, paid cash, vanished without a trace. The girls disappeared from the slave rolls and, a few years later, re-emerged as backgrounds no one challenged. In New Orleans, Celestine worked her way into the good graces of priests and city officials. She wrote generous checks to churches and charities, always showing up at Mass in plain black, playing the role of the grieving widow who spent her life on good works. People in the neighborhood saw girls in her garden sometimes and asked about them, and she'd just sigh and tell them they were poor orphans she was training for domestic service, a respectable path for unlucky but decent young women. Nobody ever wondered why these girls never seemed to leave. Nobody paid much attention when new faces showed up and old ones vanished. The house had high walls and always shut shutters. Whatever Celestine did stayed behind them. In a city that valued minding your business, privacy was a given. By 1833, she kept 8 girls at various stages of training. The oldest was almost 14, which Celestine had decided was the sweet spot. Just old enough for a legal marriage in much of the South, still young enough to mold. Well taught in the ways of running a household, and, after everything, too traumatized to question where life had taken them. The first girl she considered a true success was the one who used to be called Celia, now Claire Devo. Claire moved through the house quietly, almost invisible, as if she'd learned early on that fading into the background was how you survived. She balanced the household books to the penny. Her needlework was perfect. Her manners were beyond criticism. She could chat about the weather, church news, or housework with just the right amount of interest, never letting anything real slip. She was ready to be sold. Celestine's clients came to her through whispers and introductions, never ads or direct offers. She built ties with merchants, lawyers, and brokers, men who knew other men with new money and big ambitions, the kind who wanted wives to boost their standing but couldn't wed into old families. If one of these men complained he couldn't find a proper wife, an intermediary might mention, with care, that Madame Vasher sometimes knew of well-bred girls who'd fallen on hard times. Everything about the introduction was deliberate. The man came to the house for tea, sat with the girl, always in Celeste Stein's presence. The girl played her part, modest, educated, grateful for a chance to earn respectability. Her invented story came up briefly, some family tragedy, no relations left, rescued by Madame Vacher's charity. Then they'd move the conversation along. The men who took tea in Celeste Stein's parlor weren't looking for romance. They wanted a wife who would manage the house, have legitimate children, and elevate their name. They didn't ask questions. They didn't want answers that might mess up the deal. In March 1834, Claire Deveau married Thomas Hargrave, a cotton factor from Natchez. He made his money buying crops from small farmers and selling them to bigger players. He was 42. Claire was just shy of 14, though her papers said 16. The wedding was quick and quiet, in a church Celeste Stein had supported with hefty donations. Claire wore a dress Celeste Stein had ordered just for her. She spoke her vows clearly, her face blank. Celeste Stein watched, satisfied. Thomas Hargrave handed over $3,000. He called it an introduction fee and payment for Claire's guardianship, all off the record. With no paper trail for anyone to question, Claire Hargrave vanished into the slow, ordered life of a planter's wife. She ran Thomas's household smoothly, entertained his business friends, and had 3 children in 4 years. To anyone watching, she was just another Southern wife, no different from dozens of others. But sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up choking, haunted by dreams of auction blocks and grabbing hands, only to remind herself she was Claire Deveau Hargrave, orphaned by fever, that Celia had never existed. Celeste Stein, pleased with how things turned out, decided to expand. By 1835, she'd moved her operation to a bigger house on the edge of New Orleans, a crumbling old plantation, half swallowed by weeds. Gardens and high walls kept the world out. Inside, isolation made it easy to take in more girls. Maison de Grace now held 15, each in a different stage of transformation. Celestine picked her staff with care. She brought in women who carried secrets of their own, women who understood the importance of not asking too many questions. There was a seamstress who taught the girls needlework along with the right way to carry themselves. The housekeeper, who had run from a violent husband, valued silence above all. The music instructor knew that teaching piano wasn't really about music. It was about showing off poise and polish. Training got tougher. The girls spent hours practicing empty conversation, learning to talk without saying anything real. They memorized elaborate, invented family trees until the lines blurred into false memories. Fashion plates, society columns. Celestine made sure they could spot quality and taste at a glance. She drilled them on household management until they could plan menus, keep accounts, and organize staff in their sleep. Celestine grew bolder. She introduced the girls to clients with growing sophistication. She threw small gatherings, never formal, so potential husbands could watch the girls mingle, thinking they were at charity events for Madame Vacher's program. The men believed they were meeting educated, respectable young women. Every conversation was staged, every moment controlled. Between 1834 and 1840, Celestine arranged 14 marriages. Always the same routine, a quiet wedding, a hefty payment for Celestine, a young bride vanishing into a new life with no past anyone could trace. The girls were young, 13 to 16, but their papers always claimed they were older. Their husbands, merchants, overseers, men who'd scraped together enough to buy small plantations, speculators flush with land profits. Money poured in, $3,000 a girl at first, then 5 as Celestine's reputation spread among those in the know. She didn't squander it. She bought property in New Orleans, Charleston, Mobile. She kept up her donations, polishing her image as a pious benefactor, but the whole system ran on constant, watchful control. Any girl who showed a streak of independence had to be dealt with quickly before she could blow the operation wide open. Celestine used every trick a jailer knew: isolation, reward, punishment, breaking down identities, building dependence. Some girls buckled. They pulled into themselves, barely speaking. Others became strange and mechanical, drifting through lessons with blank faces. A few, remarkably, kept some spark alive, hiding it under perfect masks of obedience. And sometimes girls just vanished, gaps in the records that Celestine never explained. In 1837, trouble found her. A girl Celestine had married off to a Mobile merchant died in childbirth. The death itself wasn't shocking. Mothers died often in the South. But the doctor saw right away the girl was much younger than the 16 claimed on her papers. The merchant, lost in grief and maybe guilt, clammed up. Whispers started. People wondered about Madame Vacher's school. Where did these girls come from, really? A lawyer in Mobile took an interest. He wrote to Louisiana, asking questions about Celestine's credentials, poking around. Celestine didn't panic. She upped her donations. She invited city leaders to tour the academy, letting them see only what she wanted them to see. She produced flawless papers, wrote letters full of outrage that anyone would doubt her Christian charity. The lawyer's investigation fizzled out. Still, Celestine took the warning. She tightened her paperwork, making sure every detail in the girls' histories lined up. She arranged fewer marriages, spread them between cities so no one could spot a pattern. She drew even more powerful men into her. Celestine kept her operation hidden. The system just adjusted and kept going. By 1840, Maison de Grace was a fixture in New Orleans, outwardly a charitable academy, but behind closed doors, something far more sinister. Celestine moved through society with ease, showing up at respectable gatherings, giving advice about household matters, education, whatever people wanted to ask. Her reputation looked untouchable, but the girls who passed through her house, they knew the truth. For them, life before age 10 had vanished. Their identities were made up, bought, and sold. Their futures decided by deals they never saw and couldn't control. Sometimes in those rare, quiet moments, they'd remember scraps of their old lives, a mother singing, a brother's laugh, the taste of a meal in the cramped quarters behind some big house. But those memories faded fast, pushed further away by layers of lies and forced forgetting. Celestine drilled it into them. Survival meant fully embracing the story she'd invented. Any attempt to reclaim their real pasts got them labeled as crazy or criminal. Either they were mad women, not to be believed, or runaway slaves, hunted down and dragged back. The law gave them nothing. Society refused to see them as anything but the roles Celestine assigned. They were boxed in by identities someone else had bought, built, and sold. There was no way back to the selves they'd lost. So when does the horror really hit? Is it when Celestine first stared at a child on the auction block and saw a chance to make money, not a person? Or when the first girl realized her name and her history had been wiped out and replaced? Or maybe it's when the first marriage was arranged, sending a traumatized child to a man who paid for a wife with no family ties to get in the way. But before we get to how Celestine's secrets finally came out, ask yourself, what made women like Celestine Vacherie build these systems? Was it just about profit, or was there something even darker at play? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has you hooked, share it with someone who loves a grim historical mystery. Now let's see how her perfect scheme started to fall apart. The cracks showed up where Celestine never expected. February 1842, a young woman walked into a lawyer's office in New Orleans, looking for answers about inheritance law. Her name was Anne Dural. She'd been married 3 years to a sugar planter in St. Charles Parish. After giving birth to a daughter, her mind started dredging up memories that didn't fit the life she was told to remember. She recalled dark skin, hands that didn't match the pale ones she now owned, a different name that haunted her dreams and then slipped away by morning. The lawyer, Fipria, thought her questions were strange, but not alarming. She asked if a woman could challenge her own birth records if she thought they were fake. Could a marriage be annulled if someone lied about their background? Could someone inherit property if their official identity didn't line up with who they really were? Rhea pushed gently. Anne dodged. She brought up Madame Vacher's academy, mentioned missing memories before age 10, spoke of other women with the same gaps, now wives of wealthy men across Louisiana and beyond. Rhea started digging. He found 4 more women in New Orleans who'd come from Celestine's academy and married into good families. He tracked down marriage licenses, baptismal records, letters of introduction, all perfectly in order, yet none of it connecting to anyone before Celestine. He reached out to colleagues in Mobile, Charleston, Savannah. Slowly replies trickled in. Yes, they'd noticed the pattern, young wives, perfect manners, no past anyone could trace, and families with no relatives left alive. Marriages kept happening through the same network of go-betweens, with money changing hands, way more than any normal introduction fee. But digging into this meant accusing respected families of trafficking human beings. It meant saying out loud that important men had bought wives with fake identities. It meant tearing apart marriages, questioning whether children were actually legitimate, and dragging secrets into the light that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Rayard went to see a friend of his, a judge he'd known since they were kids. They sat in the judge's library, sipping brandy and talking around the subject, never naming names. What if, Rayard asked, a woman had gotten children through slave auctions and private sales? What if she'd faked their identities, trained them to run households, and then set up marriages for them, collecting a hefty payment each time? What crimes would that actually be? The judge thought it over. Which laws exactly? If the kids were legally enslaved when she got them, freeing them without the right paperwork would be an issue, but just buying them in the first place might not be a crime. Faking documents was fraud, sure. Arranging marriages for minors without legal authority could be challenged. But proving any of this would be almost impossible. You'd need witnesses. You'd need the women themselves to admit where they came from. Basically, to risk being sent back into slavery. The husbands would have to admit they'd been tricked, which would put their own children at risk, their status questioned. And you'd be asking the authorities to go after people who could ruin their careers. So in the end, the law doesn't give you any way forward. The law, the judge said, exists to keep things running smoothly. This would blow everything up. Powerful men don't want these questions asked. But Rayard didn't drop it. He kept looking into it. He met with Anderon a few more times, writing down what little she could remember. He spoke with 2 other women from the Maison de Grace. They all had the same story. Childhoods wiped clean, new identities manufactured for them. Then he noticed something else, a pattern. Of the 14 women Celeste Stein had married off by 1842, 5 were dead already. 2 had died in childbirth, 1 from fever, 2 from something vague like decline or melancholy. That's a lot more than you'd expect. Even in the 1840s South, where yellow fever, cholera, and childbirth killed plenty of young women. Was it just bad luck? Or was something darker going on? Women trapped in lives they couldn't stand. Pushed so far they chose death over living another day as someone they weren't. Rayard pulled all his notes together and brought them to the district attorney in March 1843. He expected action. Instead, he got a warning. The DA, looking out for his own future, made it clear taking this case would destroy him. Too many important families were involved. Too many respectable men had something to lose. Too many questions about race, identity, and slavery would come up. So you're saying, the DA said, that men we all know, men we do business with, have bought women, maybe of African descent, changed their identities, and married them. You're saying children raised as white and free might have enslaved grandparents. You want us to pull apart everything over transactions that technically are legal. Do you get what would happen if this went public? Rayard pushed back. The law should protect these women. The DA shook his head. The law protects property and order. These women are married. Their kids are legitimate. If you expose this, you'll cause chaos. You'll make people question every marriage arranged in private. You'll open up questions about race that no one wants answered. Drop this, or you'll lose your practice and your future. Rayard had a choice. Push ahead and wreck his own life, and maybe the lives of the very women he was trying to help, or step back and let Celeste Stein's scheme keep running. In the end, he found a third way. He stopped his official investigation. He kept digging just quietly this time. Rayard pulled together everything he'd found. Names of the women who'd come through the maison, the men who married them, the money Celestine pocketed, the pattern of fake documents. He sealed it all up in a file and left it with a court clerk, along with instructions. Open this only if certain things happen. Then he told Anderon to stop poking around, to go home to her husband. If she wanted to protect herself and her daughter, she had to keep living the lie. The truth wouldn't save her. It would ruin them both. He told her, "You're a Durand. Born sickly, orphaned by fever, educated by Madame Vacherie. That's your story now. Stick to it," and she did. She went back to St. Charles Parish and never reached out to Rayard again. Did she find peace pretending to be someone else? Or did those memories of her real childhood haunt her forever? No one knows. The records go quiet, but Rayard's investigation set things in motion anyway. Word got back to Celestine. Her network always knew when someone started asking questions. Lawyers, clerks, officials, they owed her, and they warned her. She saw the risk. Her operation wasn't bulletproof anymore, so she changed things up. Fewer girls, more time between placements. The paperwork got even tighter. She lined up more powerful friends. She amped up her charity work too, making herself look like the ultimate model of Christian virtue. And she made sure the women she'd placed knew exactly what was at stake if they ever talked. She visited some of them, all friendly smiles, but the threat hung in the air. If they spoke up, it wouldn't just take down Celestine, it would destroy them and their children. Admitting where they'd come from would wreck their marriages, strip their kids of legitimacy, maybe even force them back into slavery. Silence was the only safe option. The whole system depended on that. The women couldn't talk without burning their own lives down. The husbands couldn't admit the truth or they'd lose everything too. The authorities wouldn't go after Celestine, they couldn't risk the chaos. Priests and lawyers who'd helped make it all happen, they'd get dragged down as well, so everyone kept quiet, not because of threats, but because they all had something to lose. Between 1843 and 1847, Celestine arranged 7 more marriages. She was even more careful this time. The paperwork was flawless. The introductions looked perfect. Money changed hands with no trail. But underneath, things were getting darker. Celestine got more paranoid and the pressure on the girls grew. Their training turned brutal. They were isolated, warned again and again that one slip would mean disaster, not just for them, but for everyone they cared about. In 1845, one girl couldn't take it anymore. Her original name is lost. The records call her Isabelle Fontaine. She was 13. She hanged herself in her room at the Maison de Grace. Celestine called it a tragic accident, a girl, some tangled bedsheets, nothing more. The coroner, who'd pocketed plenty from Celestine over the years, wrote it up just that way, but the other girls understood. There was no way out. You couldn't resist. You couldn't confess. Not even death set you free. Your life wasn't yours. It had been bought and sold, and you'd keep living the lie until the bitter end. This is where everything changes. The story slips from exploitation into something even darker. Celestine didn't just rely on cruelty. She built a system where silence was safer than truth, where exposure threatened to destroy everyone involved. Just when you think you've seen the worst, it gets worse. And here's where things start to unravel. Not because of police or investigators, but from somewhere nobody expected. Enslaved people working on plantations where Celestine's former students had become mistresses started passing around stories. Late at night, behind the big houses, when they finally caught a break, someone would whisper about girls who'd been bought at auction and vanished. Not into freedom, but into a different kind of prison. This new bondage hid behind a mask of privilege. Sisters, daughters, cousins, people talked about how these girls disappeared from the slave system without really getting free. They weren't truly liberated. They were just handed off to another owner. These stories traveled. They reached the free black communities in New Orleans through underground networks, channels white society liked to pretend didn't exist. Ministers, teachers, activists, anyone who still had a sliver of room to fight back, caught wind of what was happening and tried to keep track of the violence that stayed hidden from official eyes. Father Antoine Lair was one of them. He was a Creole priest, serving a mixed-race congregation in a church near the French Quarter. In 1846, an elderly woman found him. She had bought her own freedom years ago, and now she carried a story that sounded almost impossible. Her granddaughter, a light-skinned 8-year-old, had been sold at auction in Charleston in 1838. The woman never gave up searching for her. She followed every rumor, tracked down every scrap of news, and the trail kept leading her back to New Orleans, to Madame Vacher's school, to a fleeting glimpse of a girl in a garden, then gone behind high walls. She even tried approaching the Maison de Grace, but guards sent her away. They stole her life, she told Father Clerk. Not just her freedom. Her whole life, her name, her family, her history. They made her someone else and sold her off as a white man's wife. She doesn't even know her grandmother is searching. Father L. Clerk started digging. He worked outside the legal system, in ways Rayard never could. He talked to enslaved people who'd seen girls bought by a well-dressed white woman at auctions. He found free people of color who'd crossed paths with Celestine during her travels. He collected stories and testimonies from people whose voices the law ignored. And what he found backed up Renard's discoveries. Except Father Lair had something Renard didn't, a network of people with nothing left to lose. These folks had already been pushed out of polite society. Celestine's operation was protected, sure, but their testimony could still shine a light on the truth, even if no court would ever listen. Father Lair documented 23 girls Celestine had acquired between 1829 and 1846. He traced 17 into marriages across the South. He found 5 dead. One had vanished completely. No marriage, no death, nothing. The last girl's fate stayed a mystery. In November 1846, he brought everything to the Archbishop of New Orleans. He argued the church couldn't look away. They had a duty to dig into a system trafficking children and arranging fraudulent marriages. But the Archbishop hesitated. If they exposed Celestine, they'd have to admit Catholic priests had performed sham marriages. The scandal would hit prominent Catholic families all over Louisiana. In the end, the Archbishop ordered Father Lair to stop and destroy his records. Father Lair refused. He said he couldn't just look the other way, and they sent him off to a tiny parish up north, getting locked in a tiny room for 3 weeks, barely given enough food to survive, unless she agreed to do what they wanted. Another girl got a different threat. If she didn't obey, they'd send her back to slavery. Celestine kept copies of all the original sale documents, so she could snatch back any girl who tried to resist. Then there was the third one. She was told her little sister would be bought and treated even worse if she didn't play along. The woman who told these stories shared her testimony in abolitionist newspapers back in 1847, hiding behind a pseudonym. Her accounts were graphic and unsettling, not just exposing Celestine's operation, but the entire system that allowed it to exist. The laws that made children into property, the social code that demanded silence, the money that turned people into merchandise. Southern newspapers called it all a pack of abolitionist lies. They claimed the stories were made up just to smear the South. The woman's name was fake, they said. She had no proof, no way to back up her claims. But the damage was done. People were talking. Questions that used to be whispered behind closed doors were suddenly out in the open, at least in some places. Pressure started building for Louisiana officials to do something. By May 1847, a grand jury assembled in New Orleans to investigate fraud and child trafficking. Celestine got subpoenaed. She showed up at court dressed all in severe black, flanked by 3 lawyers, and laid out a mountain of paperwork: birth certificates, baptism records, death certificates, glowing letters from priests and officials, financial records showing donations and legitimate business expenses, character references from half the city's high society. She told the jury she ran a charitable academy for orphaned girls, introducing them to respectable men looking for wives, and that she got paid fairly for all her years of good works and teaching. Any talk of trafficking or fraud? Lies, she said, just abolitionist troublemakers stirring up hate. The girls from Maison de Grace took the stand and backed her up, every single word. They spoke of her kindness, her Christian charity, her tireless care for orphans. Eyes wet, they shared stories of their families lost to fever, accidents, and ruin, always with the same details, always perfectly in sync. One girl, Marie Rousseau, said she'd arrived at the Maison at 9 after both parents died of cholera in Mobile. Madame Vacherie had found her with distant relatives who couldn't afford to keep her. She described the gentle care, the education, the preparation for a decent life. Her testimony was so moving that some grand jurors actually cried, but they missed the way her hands shook, how she never quite looked anyone in the eye, how every answer sounded memorized, rehearsed over and over. The prosecutor picked up on it. He asked her to describe her earliest memory of her parents. She hesitated, just for a second, then painted a picture. Their house in Mobile, a garden full of magnolias, her mother's lullabies. The images felt real, almost too real. In fact, they were lifted word for word from a novel that had come out 3 years earlier, though nobody in the room seemed to notice. When pressed to name any neighbors or family friends from Mobile who could vouch for her story, she said the fever had taken everyone. No one left alive who remembered her family. It was a perfect answer. Nobody could check. Nobody could prove anything. The questioning dragged on for 3 hours. In total, 5 girls testified. Each told a heartbreaking story, each one tight and impossible to pick apart, every bit of paperwork in perfect order. Each played the part of grateful orphan so convincingly that doubting them felt cruel. But the grand jury didn't know what was really happening. They couldn't have known that Celestine had drilled these girls for weeks, rehearsing every possible question, every tricky detail, until their stories were flawless. She'd taught them how to cry on cue, to show just the right shade of feeling, to tell their made-up stories with so much detail they started to believe them. The warning was always clear, but she didn't threaten them with violence. Nothing that would leave a mark or create evidence. No, she'd just remind them about the original documents locked in her safe. Bills of sale, proof they were property, records she could use to drag them back as runaway slaves if they ever dared to tell the truth. She'd remind them that, hollow as their lives felt, this was still better than the alternative. And she never let them forget their children. Some had already given birth, children who by law were white, free, and rightful heirs to their father's estates. Those kids' futures hung by a thread. If their mothers were exposed, everything would come crashing down. The women would be ruined. Their children would lose everything, inheritance, status, even the legal protection of whiteness. They'd fall into that gray area, neither fully accepted nor protected, in a society that punished anyone who didn't fit. The girls got it. They told their stories perfectly. They performed like their children's lives depended on it, because they did. The grand jury didn't find a reason to bring charges. The system took care of its own. The paperwork was airtight. The stories lined up. No one wanted to embarrass the city's best families. But one juror, Samuel Guidry, couldn't shake what he'd seen. He watched the girls on the stand. There was something in their eyes, blank, far away, like the look soldiers get after a battle. They talked about rescue, about gratitude, but their eyes said something else. Guidry started poking around, quietly, with his business contacts. Had anyone noticed the sudden appearance of young wives with no pasts? Had they heard the whispers about Madame Bellerose's academy? Wasn't it odd that so many orphans from far-off cities ended up here, all with the same suspiciously vague histories? Some people just shrugged it off. A few admitted they'd noticed too, but why dig? It wouldn't help their business. One man, after a few drinks, even said he'd thought about going to Celestine for a wife once, but decided he'd rather marry his cousin than stir up that kind of trouble. "We all know what she's doing," he muttered. "We pretend not to, because if we admit it, we'd have to face just how many things in our world work the same way. How many fortunes rest on deals no one wants to talk about? How many respectable families survive by never asking where people really come from?" Guidry wrote to the governor. Nothing. He contacted the local paper, suggested an investigation. The editor refused, said they'd get sued for libel without proof. So, frustrated, Guidry found Philip Renard, the man whose earlier investigation had been shut down. Together they started building a record, not for a trial, they knew now that was pointless, but for history. Maybe someday someone would want to know the truth, once the world changed enough to care. They wrote down everything. How the trafficking worked, the laws that made kids into property, the customs that turned women into housekeepers and mothers of heirs, the money that made creating wives more profitable than any honest job, the silence that protected everyone, because if the truth got out, it would ruin them all. They sealed the file and left it with the court, where it sat untouched for 70 years. Celestine walked out of court in June 1847. Her reputation took a hit, but the law said she was in the clear. Case closed. By the rules of 1840s, Louisiana justice had been served, but a courtroom win didn't guarantee her safety. The scandal, even managed as it was, made the right people nervous. The lawyers and brokers who once quietly made introductions started backing away. Families who used to send people Celestine's way stopped mentioning her name entirely. The whole network she'd built, the one that kept her business alive, began to unravel. New clients didn't show up the way they used to. The men who did come were different, nervous, poorer, asking questions her old clients never dared. She couldn't charge what she used to. The girls she brought in were harder to place. By 1848, Maison de Grace had shrunk to just 7 girls. It used to be 15. Celestine's bills didn't shrink with her income. She started selling off property just to keep things afloat. She mortgaged the house on Prytania Street. All that careful planning, all those years keeping her finances balanced. It was all falling apart. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the girls. The trial had forced them to face in public just how fake their lives really were. They'd stood up in court, told lies, acted out stories Celestine had invented, then came back to the house and kept living those lies behind closed doors. One girl, just 14 and supposed to meet her future husband soon, suddenly refused to answer to the name Celestine had given her. She wouldn't say her real name either. Maybe she didn't remember it, but she rejected the false one. Celestine tried everything, punishment, bribes, isolation, but nothing worked. In August 1848, the girl hanged herself. She left no note. Her made-up identity died with her, and only the other girls at Maison de Grace seemed to grieve for whoever she'd been before Celestine bought her. Another girl, a little older, started having strange episodes. She'd speak in a child's voice, say words and phrases that didn't fit the story Celestine had written for her. The other girls knew what was happening. Bits of the real past were breaking through, memories bubbling up through the layers of training and lies. Celestine brought in a doctor. He called it hysteria and prescribed isolation and cold baths. The treatment was harsh, but it stopped the episodes. The girl learned to lock away that voice from her past, to bury it so deep it never escaped again. 6 months later, she married a merchant in Baton Rouge. She lived 40 more years, had 4 kids, never spoke of her childhood. Sometimes, though, her grandchildren caught her whispering to herself in a strange voice, a child's voice, speaking a language they didn't know. But this story doesn't end with Celestine's legal acquittal. It ends with something quieter, a kind of justice that hurts even more. In September 1848, 2 women who'd graduated from Maison de Grace years earlier ran into each other at a church social in New Orleans. They hadn't seen each other since one of them married and left. The meeting was short, polite, just what you'd expect from respectable married women. But for a moment, in a glance, they recognized each other. They didn't say anything anyone else would notice, but in that look, they both admitted the truth. Under their polished identities were lost childhoods, stolen names, histories no one could ever give back. One of them, Margaret Sullivan Beaumont, or whatever her real name was, left early, blaming a headache. She walked down to the levee and watched the Mississippi for over an hour, thinking about those currents, the depth, the bodies that river had swallowed over the years. Then she went home. She lived 6 more years, but something inside her broke in that moment, a crack in the illusion that her pain was unique, that she was alone in her tragedy. She'd always known, in theory, that there were others. But looking into another woman's eyes and seeing the same carefully constructed lie made it all real in a way nothing else ever had. Between 1847 and 1849, 12 women who'd passed through Maison de Grace died. Childbirth, fever, consumption, accidents. The causes looked ordinary on paper. But there was a pattern. Women with invented lives, erased pasts, dying at rates that didn't make sense, no matter what the death certificates said. Childbirth gone wrong. Pneumonia after the flu, months wasted away by consumption. Someone lost to a sudden drowning. Taken one at a time, none of these deaths stood out. But when you look at them together, something else creeps in, a pattern that feels heavier than just bad luck. Was it all just part of life in the 1840s South? Back then, yellow fever, cholera, childbirth, they claimed women's lives all the time. That's what the doctors wrote in their journals. Fever, weakness, sadness, a slow fading. They diagnosed what they could, stuck to humoral theory, and did their best with what little they understood. But if you read between the lines, there's a different story hiding underneath. Women who had survived 3 births suddenly dying in a 4th pregnancy that shouldn't have been any more dangerous. Women in their 20s falling apart, their doctors calling it nervous exhaustion or brain fever, names for what we'd later call depression and anxiety. Some women just seemed to slip away, month after month, no clear cause, just a will to live that quietly vanished. One left behind a letter. People called her death melancholy. The letter never went public, but copies exist in private hands. Her husband found it tucked into her Bible just hours after she died. He read it once, standing in her empty room, and then locked it away for 30 years. His children found it after he died, and they argued about whether to destroy it. It was too much in some ways, but in the end they kept it, maybe as proof of something they couldn't quite name. The letter started with an apology. "I have to write this," she said, "even though it won't change anything. I'm not blaming anyone. I just need to admit at least once what my life really was." She wrote about living as an actress, every day a show. Always the perfect hostess wife, mother, always watching herself, remembering which story went to which person, never slipping up, always patching the holes in her made-up past. "I've become so good at lying," she wrote. "I don't even know what the truth is anymore." She could describe a childhood that never happened. She could cry over parents she'd never met. She'd repeated her stories so many times they felt real, but underneath it all, nothing, just emptiness where her real history should be. She wrote about how it wore her down, the fear of being found out, the loneliness of knowing no one, not even her own children, would ever really know her. She lived in a house full of people who loved a version of her that didn't exist. "My children ask about their grandmother," she wrote. "They want to know what she was like, where she came from. I have to make up a woman, invent memories of love and loss that never happened. I'm teaching them to build their lives on stories I made up." What kind of mother does that? But the worst part, what really broke her, were the moments when her real past slipped through the cracks. Bits of memory bubbled up in her dreams. A woman's voice singing, a smell from a kitchen she couldn't name, words in a language she'd been told to forget. Those fragments felt more real than anything she'd invented, but she couldn't hold on to them. She couldn't build a life from scraps. She'd wake up and feel herself unraveling, not sure what was real, what was planted by Madame Vasher, what was actually hers. "I'm a ghost," she wrote. "I haunt my own life. Every mirror shows me someone I don't know. Every question about my childhood forces another lie. I've lived with lies so long, I've lost the truth. What's the point of gaining a respectable life if you lose yourself entirely?" The letter kept going, page after page, describing, down to the smallest detail, what they did at the Maison de Grace to break people down and build new identities. The endless repetition, the isolation, the mind games. She wrote it all. She described how the academy trained girls to disconnect from their own memories, to treat their pasts like half-remembered dreams or hallucinations that needed to be buried. She wrote about other girls she'd known there, some rumored dead, others swept away into marriages all over the South. All of them carried the same heavy secret. Their lives had been rewritten, their histories erased. She finished with a line that really got to the heart of what Celestine's operation had done. Madame Vachiri didn't just steal our freedom or our childhoods. She stole our chance to know ourselves. She turned us into strangers inside our own skin. She taught us that to survive, we had to wipe out who we really were. And worst of all, she was right. I survived. I have a nice house, healthy children, a good standing in society. But surviving cost me everything. The girl I once was is gone. I've mourned her more deeply than anyone else I've ever lost, because she's the one person I can never get back. I don't even know her name. She signed the letter with her married name, the only identity she had left. As for Celestine, she died in November 1849, age 54. The official cause was heart failure. She died in her house on Britannia Street, surrounded by all the signs of respectability she'd spent her life collecting. She died alone. No family sat with her. She always claimed she had none, and maybe that was the truth for once. The girls from Maison de Grace stood in her room as she died, dry-eyed and silent. They'd been taught to hide their feelings unless it served a purpose, and there was nothing to gain from mourning the woman who had stolen their childhoods and sold off their futures. A priest came to give last rites. Celestine confessed, but whatever she said stayed between her and God. Did she admit to selling children, forging papers, wiping out people's identities? Or did she dress it up as charity, a rescue mission, a kindness for girls who had nowhere else to go? Did she die thinking she'd done good? Or did she know exactly what she'd done? Nobody knows. The priest never shared what she told him, but people noticed he looked older and shaken in the days after she died. Her estate got split up among a handful of Catholic charities. The house was sold. Maison de Grace became just another private home. The 7 girls who were left didn't last long. 3 married off within months, rushed through quick arrangements that felt more like panic than planning. 2 got sent away, one to a convent in Mobile, another to a boarding school in Charleston, each with a fake story to explain how they got there. Nobody officially recorded what happened to the last 2. They just disappeared. Their made-up names dropped, their real ones lost. A doctor bought the house on Britannia Street, not knowing a thing about its past. His family lived there 15 years before moving out. The house changed owners again and again, each one fixing it up, repainting, erasing the past until nothing of Maison de Grace was left. At least, that's how it seemed. But in the 1890s, workers doing renovations broke through a false wall and found a tiny hidden room. It looked like a cell. Scratches covered the walls where someone had marked the days, names gouged into the floorboards with fingernails, words in languages nobody could read. The room was barely 6 by 8 feet, no windows, just a little grate near the ceiling for air. The workers showed the room to the owner, who told them to fill it with concrete and seal it forever. He didn't want to know anything more. Nobody did. The house was sold soon after. and the new owners heard nothing about what had been found. No one ever investigated Celestine's operation. No charges, nothing. Nobody even tried to track the women she scattered across the South. The system protected her while she lived, and even after she was gone, it kept right on doing its job. After her death, people kept up the conspiracy of silence. But out of sight, free people of color and enslaved communities kept their own kind of record-keeping alive. They remembered the names of girls who disappeared into Celestine's world, whispered stories of how she picked her victims, warned mothers to watch out for the women prowling auctions, hunting for light-skinned children. No one dared write any of this down back then. If you were enslaved, reading or writing was a crime. If you were free and black, you still knew putting those stories on paper could get you killed. Still, the stories survived. People passed them down, each generation holding on to the truth hidden from the official records. After emancipation, some finally spoke out. Former slaves described how children vanished from auction blocks, bought by white women dressed respectably, claiming they wanted house servants but actually feeding a much darker trade. Agents from the Freedmen's Bureau and abolitionist historians listened and wrote these stories down at last. Their testimonies lined up with details nobody had dared touch in Celestine's day. So what do the records show once you piece them together? Private letters, sealed depositions, church registers, everything Rayard and Fatherlaire managed to gather. Philippe Renard's sealed file didn't just list names and dates. He had financial records. He'd convinced a clerk to break the rules for the sake of justice. The numbers were staggering. Over $200,000 deposited between 1829 and 1849. That's a fortune, all built on trafficking children. The money trail led everywhere. Property all over the South, investments in banks and railroads, cotton futures, even donations to charity. Celestine used those gifts to boost her image and buy herself protection. Payments went out to lawyers, officials, and priests, not as bribes, but as legal fees and consults to keep people on her side. Fatherlaire's own files dug even deeper. He traced the women who passed through Maison de Grace, mapped their marriages, their children, their deaths. He talked to people who remembered them, who saw their struggles and pain. The patterns jumped out, things that single cases would have hidden. Women dying young, so many lost in childbirth, not from medical complications, but from what looked like a loss of will to live. Between 1829 and 1849, Celestine Vasher bought at least 34 children at auctions and through private deals. She gave them new names and fake backstories, complete with forged papers. She trained them in how to run a household, how to fit in, until they could pass as educated young women from good families. She arranged marriages for at least 27 of those girls, matching them with rich men all over the South. For every deal, Celestine pocketed $3,000 to $5,000, a total of about $300,000, which would be millions today. Out of those 27 women, 18 died before they turned 30, 5 died in childbirth, 3 died by their own hand, or from what we'd now call mental breakdowns. The rest died from illnesses, probably made worse by trauma they couldn't escape. 9 women made it past 30, but only 5 left behind bits and pieces, letters, diaries, testimonies scattered in private hands and sealed archives. These scraps tell the story of women forced to live their whole lives inside made-up identities, never able to reclaim their real past without destroying themselves and their children. Celestine's system only worked because so many people played along. Auctioneers never asked why a lady wanted to buy young girls. Officials accepted forged documents and looked the other way. Priests married people without checking their stories. Husbands didn't dig into their wives' pasts. Lawyers and judges kept quiet, choosing comfort over truth. Everyone had a reason to stay silent. Together, they built a system that turned children into property, wiped out their real selves, and sold them off, that were somehow both legal and fraudulent at the same time. The last document in those sealed records comes from March 1849, 3 months after Celestine died. It's just a short letter from Anne Durand, the same woman who first went to Fiperia, looking for answers about where she came from. Anne wrote her letter in a careful, practiced hand on expensive paper. She said she'd just had her 4th child, another daughter. Holding that baby, she was hit with a memory so sharp it felt like she'd slipped into another life. She saw herself as a little girl, cradling a baby, someone telling her, "This is your sister. You must protect her." But as suddenly as it appeared, the memory was gone. Anne tried to chase it, to hold on to it, maybe remember whatever happened to that sister, but there was nothing, just emptiness. No context, no details she could track down. She'd found some evidence lately that she might have had siblings who were taken from her when she was young. The memories she had were so faint she couldn't tell if they were real or just dreams. Other children, other voices, other names. Still, she wrote, she'd never go looking for them. She wouldn't try to prove any of it. Because that would mean admitting her whole adult life was a lie. Her marriage, her children's inheritance, their place in society, all based on a made-up identity. I've learned, Anne wrote, that some truths are more dangerous than lies. Sometimes to survive, you have to accept the story you've been given. Freedom isn't the same as escape. She wrote this with a kind of poetry that hurts to read. I have 4 daughters now. I look at them and wonder if somewhere I have sisters I'll never meet. I wonder if they're alive, if they remember me, if they wonder what happened to the child I was. But I can't look for them, because if I found them, what would I say? That I gave up our past to live comfortably, that I picked a new name over our real bond, that I left them behind in bondage while I passed for white and free. She wrote about the guilt that comes with surviving by erasing yourself, with knowing that her children's advantages, education, inheritance, their whole place in the world, came from destroying her real identity and leaving behind whatever family she once had. My daughters will never know their real grandmother. They'll never hear stories about where they actually come from. They'll build their lives on the fiction I was taught to perform, and I'll help them do it, because the only other option is to throw them into the chaos of having no identity at all. Anne ended her letter with a question that hangs over every testimony, every deposition, every half-lost record from Celestine's operation. How many women in the South carry secrets like this? How many families are built on erased pasts and made-up names? How many children grow up never knowing their mother's histories were stolen and sold? And how many of us refuse to even ask these questions, because deep down, we know the answers would shatter everything we believe about ourselves? She didn't address the letter to anyone. It just ended up in Renard's sealed files, one more document the authorities would rather ignore than face. This is the story of Celestine Vasher and the Maison de Gracie, a story of trafficking disguised as charity, of identity theft turned legal by paperwork and silence, of women bought, trained, and sold, not as slaves in the eyes of the law, but as wives whose whole existence was built for someone else's profit. It's a story about how societies protect themselves by making certain truths impossible to speak, about how the law can give injustice a stamp of approval just to keep the peace, about the kind of violence that hides behind respectability, that gets sanctioned by the system itself. Maison de Gracie shut its doors in 1849, but the women who passed through it lived out their days with borrowed identities. Their children believed family stories that were pure fiction. Their grandchildren inherited places in the world built on erasure. And somewhere, deep in the archives, in files that are sealed and half forgotten, the truth is still there, written down, but left to rot. Proof of what happens when a whole society decides not to see what's right in front of them. Complicity wins out over justice. It happens when keeping the peace matters more than facing real pain. When a system runs so smoothly, even the people crushed by it can't bring themselves to say its name out loud. Celestine's grandchildren, most of them never even knew where she really came from, ended up living pretty ordinary lives scattered across the South. Some fought for the Confederacy, defending the same world that trafficked their own grandmother. Others drifted west after the war, hoping for fresh starts in towns where no one would look too hard at their family stories. Now and then, someone in the family stumbled across a piece of the past. Maybe it was a sealed letter buried in the attic, a family rumor that just didn't fit with all the official stories, or a photograph with a face that didn't line up with the European ancestry everyone claimed. But these secrets almost always stayed hidden. Too risky, too explosive, one crack in the story, and whole family trees might come tumbling down. In 1921, when researchers finally